We're here at the Reagan National Defense Forum, and joining me now is Greg Hayes, Chairman and CEO of Raytheon Technologies. Greg, it's so good to sit down with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here. In person, no Zoom.
So let's talk a little bit about something that I know you're going to be discussing in general here at the forum, and that is supplying Ukraine with the missiles and the systems, the defenses that it needs as this war with Russia continues on. Your thoughts on how that process is going so far?
Well, I would tell you so far, I think we have been pretty effective, and it's been led, of course, by DoD in terms of providing Ukraine the weapons they need to defend themselves. We still have some challenges. We just recently, I think it's 3 weeks ago now, put the first two NASAMS systems, which is a medium-range air defense system, into Ukraine. And we really did that in record time. We got on contract in less than 6 weeks. We delivered the systems within another 4 weeks. We got the Ukrainians trained, and we got the systems employed. And that's wonderful. They need more. And so this week, of course, we signed a contract to provide 6 more, but that's a 2-year process. So we're working it. I think, again, the DoD has been remarkably successful, whether it's the Stingers, whether it's the Javelins, NASAMS, whether it's the artillery shells. We have done a lot, but more. They need more.
The fact that it's a 2-year process, is there a way to speed that up?
Well, there is no magic formula in the supply chain to accelerate this. Of course, we're working to do as much as we can to try and cut that lead time down, but there are thousands of components, and not surprisingly, chips are a key element in this equipment. So we're working to do what we can. We're working with the DoD to find other alternatives, perhaps, in terms of some of the suppliers. And I guess I'd defer that to Bill LaPlante tomorrow. It's a great question for him.
Okay, I want to get into more on the supply chain in just a moment, but first, you mentioned the NASAMS contract that was just issued by the DoD this week. In general, and certainly a number of analysts, I can think of Jefferies, Cowen analysts, for example, just recently, have flagged the fact that despite all of the attention, all of the interest in orders, and of course in replenishment, that it's actually taken a pretty long time for some of these contracts to manifest.
So if you think about it, most of the systems and most of the material that's been provided to the Ukrainians so far has come out of war reserves. It's come out of inventory. It's not coming off of production lines. We've provided them 5,000 Stingers, that is the DoD has, and some of the NATO allies, similar number of Javelin anti-tank missiles. We can only produce today at about 400 Javelin systems a month. We're working to double that. On the Stinger, we're working to reintroduce that to production. It's actually not been in production for a number of years. So the analysts are right. We're not delivering anything off of the factory floors to the Ukrainians. It's all coming from stock. But having said that, I would tell you the DoD, give a shout out to Bill LaPlante's organization and even the Army, have done remarkable things in terms of expediting, like the NASAMS contract. Those first 2 units, President Biden promised them to the Ukrainians in July. We were on contract. We went to the DoD. Doug Bush, Undersecretary of the Army, took the lead on that, and we had a contract by the end of September. We delivered the systems several weeks later. We had everybody trained. The DoD is working hard to try and get these contracts expedited. It's not a natural process, though.
So there's an increased demand to supply Ukraine right now, but there's also increased demand both here in the U.S. and from allies as we see defense budgets continue to increase right now. Just walk me through what that looks like at Raytheon and how quickly we can see that translate to sales.
So what I would tell you is that we have been in discussions with most of the NATO countries. I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago talking to the Secretary General. We're seeing the demand. We're not seeing all the contracts yet, and it's similar to what Germany has talked about, which is this extra $100 billion they're going to add to the defense budgets. We haven't seen a contract yet. So I think we're out there trying to capacitize, facilitize for what we know is going to happen. But given the lead times that we see today, we probably won't see a significant uptick in revenue, I would say, for at least 2 years when we actually can start delivering. And again, NASAMS are on contract. We have AMRAAM, which is the air-to-air missile, on contract now. But again, those lead times are such that it's literally 2 years from the time you sign the contract to the time you get the material in the hands of the warfighter. So it's going to take some time.
So the supply chain piece of the puzzle, how long do you expect those pains, those issues to continue? And are there things that can be done right now to help ease them?
So I would talk about supply chain. There are two issues in my mind. You have material availability and you have labor availability. And just to give you an example, at Raytheon Technologies, we've hired about 27,000 people this year. We've hired almost 10,000 engineers. We don't really have a problem attracting talent, but where am I taking that from? I'm taking that from my suppliers, I'm taking that from my other competitors. There is just a dearth of available talent. And even when we bring people in, because of the nature of most of our work, they have to have a security clearance, which will take another 6 months. So, this issue that we see, and we saw today in the jobs report, where we still see huge demand for labor. And with 3.5% or so unemployment, I think we're going to continue to struggle. Our supply chain is going to continue to struggle to find enough people to meet this demand. I can think of certain things, specifically rocket motors. We're going to see a doubling of demand in rocket motors in the next 3 years. That means the 2 rocket motor suppliers that we have here in the U.S. are going to have to ramp up production, and they're struggling today to meet demand.
Of course, one of those rocket motor makers is Aerojet Rocketdyne. There's been news reports that that company is back on the sale block. Just want to get your thoughts on the possibility of M&A, whether it's that company specifically or in general, whether there's more consolidation to be had, especially given the fact that we have regulators that have not been so keen on it, either in this industry or other industries in recent years.
Yeah, I look back at the history of Raytheon Technologies when we were United Technologies, and then we merged with Raytheon, and we made a number of major acquisitions. Goodrich back in 2013, Rockwell Collins in 2018, then merging Raytheon with UTC's aero businesses in 2020. I don't know that any of those deals could have been done in today's environment. Not because they were anti-competitive, it's just that the scale that we were trying to build and have been successful in building, I think, is now looked down upon. And the efficiencies and the costs that we've been able to take out and the technologies that we have been able to develop with all of these companies together, I don't think we're giving enough consideration for those in the current environment in terms of what the FTC and the Department of Justice are looking at with these mergers.
Now, I remember when you were closing the merger, and we sat down and we talked, you, myself, and Tom Kennedy, and one of the things you said that this merger would enable is faster development of things like hypersonics.
Yes.
Talk to me about that, because there's been some strides ahead, although maybe arguably not as quickly as we'd like to see in the current geopolitical
we've
environment.
had some very successful hypersonic developments. We just recently got on contract for the next generation, the Hawk missile. This is an air-to-air hypersonic missile that'll travel roughly Mach 5. That is something that we have been able to test, and right now we're going to just go through the development phase for the next couple of years. The fact is, the reason that was successful is because we took the materials technology that United Technologies had within their aerostructures business, which is very high temperature, lightweight, transparent material that you can use on the seeker head of a hypersonic missile. It's phenomenal technology, and this is when Tom and I first talked about the merger, that was the promise. How do you take the technology from one side, marry it to something else you're trying to do on the other side, and make 1 + 1 = 3?
And so it's happening now.
It's happening every day. It's not just hypersonics. It's things like JADC2, which we talk about, Joint Demand, Command, and Control, between our Rockwell Collins folks out in Cedar Rapids and our folks in Washington and our intelligence and space business, working together to come up with solutions that nobody else can.
And of course, when we talk about some of these high-tech, high-capability, new technologies in general, we're talking about technologies to counter China. I want to get your thoughts on China, because obviously from a defense standpoint, a national security standpoint, it's considered the pacing threat, but then it's also a major commercial aerospace market as well.
So China's it's a conundrum, I would say, and I think Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, actually gave a speech the other night, which I thought was quite interesting, where she recognized we're going to compete against China, but it's not a conflict, and we have to find ways to work together where our interests are aligned and be prepared for what could be a potential conflict down the road. Nobody wants a conflict. Nobody wins in war, and I think having a strong deterrence is our best bet. And there's a lot of technology that we're working with DoD to continue to make sure that we have the edge in that particular potential conflict. But the Chinese have made great strides in the last 10 years. Hypersonics is a great example. We stopped testing hypersonics around 2011. Took some time off for a number of years. The Chinese did not. So again, it's a real threat, but it's also, it still remains, I think, in our best interest to find a way to get along. We can't decouple from China the way we've decoupled from Russia. You know, back in February of this year, we shut down all of our Russian operations, closed our factories, and discontinued all of our commercial sales into Russia. It's about $1 billion for us. We couldn't do that with China. We are too dependent. The American economy, $400 billion of trade, too dependent on China. So it behooves us to find a way to compete, but not get into conflict.
Zero COVID policy in China. Markets have certainly been whipsawing on expectations, especially in the midst of the protests we've seen in China in recent days, about the beginnings of reopening there. What would that mean? How are you assessing that from a commercial aviation, commercial aerospace standpoint?
So commercial aerospace, as everybody knows, has come back remarkably well from 2019 levels. Right now we're at about 75% of the traffic that we saw back in 2019. The biggest piece that's missing today, China. 14% of global traffic happens in China. What we have seen is when they do reopen, traffic rebounds quickly. When they close down, traffic shrinks. And I think, you know, opening China is going to be the key to the recovery next year. As I think about 23, we think by the end of next year, assuming China reopens, we'll be back to 2019 levels of air traffic. So it is a big question. It's not just a question for us in terms of the aftermarket, but it's also a question for us in terms of our supply chain. And what we have seen with these shutdowns is all of a sudden we'll have a factory shut down for 3 or 4 weeks and you don't have parts. We have an overhaul facility in Shanghai that was shut down for 4 weeks, so no engines. Very disruptive, and hopefully the Chinese will understand that there's got to be a better way than zero COVID. It just doesn't work, as we have seen.
Your assessment of commercial aerospace in general, I mean, we've seen airlines begin to add more routes. There's this expectation that we're going to see more aircraft orders come in as well. But then balancing that against maybe a macroeconomic environment that's uncertain and the possibility of a recession.
So we talk about that. I think what's been amazing to me is the resilience of the passenger traffic this year, despite rising oil prices, higher jet fuel costs, and much higher ticket prices. And demand has remained incredibly resilient. Part of that may be because people are working from home, wherever that might be. But the fact is, people are traveling. And will there be a slowdown? In a very deep recession, certainly we'll see a slowdown in traffic. But with what we're seeing today with forward bookings, we just don't see anything on the horizon to give us undue concern. But the aerospace business is not immune from economic cycles. If there's a big recession, we'll see an impact. But again, these planes, these engines that we build, they're in service for 30 or 40 years. So you've got to take the very long view. And I think that's it's all very positive. I would tell you, Morgan, that my biggest concern for the next 10 years is where are we going to get the pilots? And there's an acute pilot shortage today in the U.S. and really globally. And as Boeing and Airbus ramp up production, the question will be, where do the pilots come from? And I think that may be the limiting factor on airline growth.
Back to labor.
Back to labor.
Everything comes back to labor in these conversations. Greg Hayes, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Morgan. Appreciate it.